No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone.
Talk about being scared of your own shadow. Pull yourself together. I'm like a small creature swallowed whole by a monster. And the monster feels my tiny movements and suffers. People are my friends. I'm one of them. I belong. The room is terribly cold. Terribly cold. I'll come. Whatever it wants of me, it can have. I'm coming apart a little at a time. A little at a time. Now I know where I'm going. I'm disappearing inch by inch into this house. It knows my name. This time it knows my name. I want to stay here.
I'll have to go out there.
No. I want to stay here always.
No! It hasn't hurt me. Why should it hurt her?
She might try to do something about it.
I will not be frightened or alone anymore.
Is it over, Theo? Is it? No. I'm so cold. It's going to start everything all over again. Get in! God, it knows I'm here.
Come back again until it finds me. On and on and on until it finds me.
Hello and welcome, literary license listeners. We will be reviewing the novel The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, as well as the 1963 film adaptation The Haunting, directed by Robert Weiss. I am your co-host, John Wilson.
Yes, I'm Keith Chawgo.
And also joining us is our special guest, Rob Kirby, an award-winning cartoonist editor of the Shirley Jackson Project, comics inspired by her life and work, which is available now at ninthartpress.com. Thank you for joining us, Rob. Can you tell our listeners a little something about yourself as well as talk about the Shirley Jackson Project?
Yes, hello. My name is Rob Kirby, as you just heard, and I've been cartooning for some time now. I'm known as an anthology editor. I won an Ignatz Award a couple years ago for a book called Queer, which was 33 contemporary queer cartoonists. An Ignatz Award it's kind of a big deal in the alt comics world anyway. The Shirley Jackson Project is, I'm just going to read from the back cover, it's just easier. 17 alternative cartoonists explore and celebrate the work of author Shirley Jackson through loose interpretations, biographies, autobiographies, and fiction. I mean, it's almost like Shirley Jackson fanfic. It just takes her stories and her novels as their springboards for different artists exploring different themes. Like, for example, one of my stories in here, illustrated by somebody else, it's called The Four Archetypes of Shirley Jackson's Stories. I think that's the title. And I just do a compare and contrast of the different characters, such as the devouring mother or the runaway, the pompous windbag. And these are all characters that show up in Shirley's work, in multiple stories and novels. And it was just a fun little interpretation of that. And other people did autobiographical stories using The Lottery or The Haunting of Hill House or any number of stuff. So yeah, interpretations, biographies.
That's brilliant.
Yes. And it just won a little award. It won a award in the New England Book Fair, something about a design award, I think.
Wow,
So,
congratulations.
yeah. And Shirley fans really like it. I just wanted to see a book of Shirley Jackson comics and there it is.
And she's back. There's before we actually get into the conversation, I know Keith had wanted to mention an adaptation that's coming soon. Keith, you want to bring that up?
Yeah, Mike Flanagan, who's having phenomenal success with Gerald's Game now on Netflix, is doing an adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, which is fully cast now. Goes into filming next month, and it's a 10-part miniseries of The Haunting of Hill House, which will be going to Netflix, hopefully early part of next year.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, I can't wait to see that. That's going to be interesting. And Keith, since we are on you here, why did you select Shirley Jackson's Haunting Hill House? Because this is your selection this month.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically it started out when I was about 10 years old. My grandmother used to have the Reader's Digest condensed books. She used to collect them. I don't know if I think I was the only person that used to read them. And they had The Lottery in it for some reason. So I've read that, and I was like totally floored by it. And I started devouring everything Shirley Jackson. Which, to my parents, I think they were a bit worried, reading some of this stuff, but post this 10-year-old. And I fell across The Haunting of Hill House, which I think it was like the 5th book I've read by her by that time. Hers. I read, Returns, the Savages book and, the other books, Sundial, etc. And I was like really in love with it. But then basically like every 6 to 10 years, I reread all Shirley Jackson's books and stuff like that. And then when I went to high school, when video came out, which I think is about 83, 84, myself extremely here. There was a video of The Haunting, and I'd never actually seen it, and I fell in love with it. Watched it over and over, bought copies of it. I think now I'm into the Blu-ray version of it now. And it's one of my all-time favorites because it works on so many different levels. And every time I read it or every time I watch it, I notice more and more things from it, like with most of Shirley Jackson's work. And that's why we chose it for our Halloween issue. The Literary License Podcast.
Rob, what do you think? What drew you? I mean, you're obviously a huge Shirley Jackson fan too. What brought you to this as well?
I explained in the introduction to the Shirley Jackson Project, my first encounter with her was actually in visual terms. My mother used to have those Reader's Digest condensed books. I don't know if you guys know what those are, but they were really big in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think they finally ended them in about the early 80s. They would just, Reader's Digest would take, they would, do condensed versions of popular fiction of the day, and they had illustrations. I remember another one had Jaws, a much later volume, but this was an early 60s edition, and they had these really beautiful drawings by what was his name? Ben something. I have the book here, thankfully. Ben Stahl, Stahl. And they're really beautiful, and they're done in that wonderful, late 50s, early 60s style. So of course, as I was really young and I didn't really read the thing yet, but I would just look at the spooky pictures that are just really wonderful. I did a little presentation of the book at a bookstore last October, and I had I dutifully found them online because I don't have the book, and put them in the presentation. So later, when I was a little older, I read the book, the condensed version. Later, I got the book so I could read the entire thing because it was really quite condensed. They take out a lot of the nuanced stuff out. And I just, as I got older, the spooky aspects of it were less important to me than just the characterizations and the psychological profiles of her characters. And, later I just devoured all the popular library paperback versions of her books. And the funny thing is that the popular library, the covers, I'm going to keep going back to visuals, I guess, because I'm a cartoonist. The covers often promised way more horror and awfulness and scary stuff than it was really actually in the books. They had to kind of sell it to the public that way. Books like Hangman had these very, suspensey sort of terror covers, which the book really, really wasn't. But just the older I got, the more sophisticated a reader I became, and the more I came to really appreciate the books, and they are wonderful for rereads. So I, when I came up with the Shirley Jackson Project, cartoonists came out of the woodwork. So many cartoonists are big fans of hers, and and I just, I mostly, when you put together an anthology, you grab your friends. And I had a lot of people, who I didn't know or whatever, who wanted to be a part of it. And I just gathered as many of them as I could, and for this kind of slim volume. And
nice. My first encounter with Shirley Jackson was also The Lottery. It was a piece that stuck with me to this day. It's sort of a testament to artists like ourselves in a way that break away from the quote unquote norm of society and following our own creative path. With Hill House, there's that same powerful force of finding and losing oneself to make your way out into the world, not being contained by anything or anyone that I can really obviously relate to as an artist. Besides that, there's something that is completely terrifying about the unknown, which is a primordial fear that most human beings have. So Shirley Jackson actually really captures and amplifies that in this book. So it's really quite chilling. So speaking of which, I'm actually going to give us a synopsis of the book. So just start us off on that discussion. So the synopsis is the classic supernatural thriller by an author who helped define the genre. First published in 1959, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House has been hailed as a perfect work of unnerving terror. It is the story of four seekers who arrive at a notoriously unfriendly pile called the Hill House. Dr. Montague, an occult scholar looking for solid evidence of the haunting, Theodora, a light-hearted assistant, Eleanor, a friendless, fragile young woman well acquainted with poltergeists, and Luke, the future heir of Hill House. At first, their stay seems destined to be merely a spooky encounter with inexplicable phenomenon, but Hill House is gathering its powers, and soon it will choose one of them to make its own. So Rob is actually going to start us off on the discussion of the book.
Okay. Well, yes, Hill House to me, it is a haunted house story, but obviously, the protagonist Eleanor is, she's been called one of Shirley Jackson's finest creations, and I absolutely agree with that. And it is basically a psychological portrait of this woman who has been sheltered her entire life. She was caring for her invalid mother for years. Shirley tells us early on that she hates her mother, who has just died. She hated her mother, who was a very demanding kind of, and who, squelched Eleanor all her life. And the only other person that Eleanor truly hated was her sister, who was just as, she had a really bad relationship with, has a bad relationship with her sister.
Yeah.
So she has basically been sheltered and has never been able to live a life of her own whatsoever. And Hill House, she decides, is when she gets the invitation to go and be a Ghostbuster at Hill House, she sees it as this wonderful adventure, or she hopes that it will be. And one of my favorite parts of the book there is just that her journey to Hill House, where we really kind of get to know Eleanor. We find that she lives in her head. She's a very interior person, and Shirley tells us that she can't blink, she can't help but blink in strong sunlight, and that she has an awkward inability to find words. So she's breaking out, and when she gets to the house, things really seem to be going well, at first. But when the supernatural manifestations begin to occur, they seem to have a real personal effect on Eleanor. And they also seem to, like that she's entwined with these events somehow, And I think that is the question of the book. It is a very unresolved question. And you figured out yourself which way you want to go, the reader. Is Eleanor somehow responsible for these manifestations? Is the house actually doing it all on its own, or are they in some weird symbiosis? Are they somehow?
I wondered that too, because part of me, which I'll dive into like later or bring up, is she? Because if you notice, the encounters that occur in the house all surround her. Like we have the stories of what people have said and what the doctor brings up, and in how he brings up these events that happened or occurred, but we don't really see them. So again, it becomes like the unreliable narrator, right? He's telling us these are the events that happened, but we're not witnessing them ourselves. But when we do witness them, we notice that they surround Eleanor, that these things tend to happen. And I almost thought, like, I don't know why, there's a part of me that was like, is she like, could she be telekinetic? Like the trauma of her own psyche is manifesting what she feels like. Because part of me is like, are there spirits? And it's great to read that and ask those questions and ask yourself and go that way.
Yeah, any ghost story, the best ghost stories are psychological studies. I mean, there's underpinnings there. Think of The Turn of the Screw. Talk about an unreliable narrator. And with Eleanor, we know right from the start she had poltergeist activity, and that in her childhood, stones fell on her house when she was a little girl, and it was obviously a very troubled house with lots of repression and probably I'm thinking a lot of shaming and stuff too. It sounds like the mother was a real piece of work.
I think, Keith, because you also brought up at one point how like Stephen King takes from that, and you think, I just immediately I think of like Carrie, this girl who doesn't know who she is coming into her womanhood, right? Mm-hmm. And things just start happening, and you could, if you were a witness to that, you would think paranormal, you would think it's a ghost, but you don't relate that, oh, maybe it's her, and that's what's happening,
Well, Stephen King, I mean, as you know, is a big fan of The Haunting of Hill House, and I mean, when you read Carrie, I didn't realize at the time, but rereading Hill House this time around is like, falling of the stones on the house, Carrie. The sister's name is Carrie. And then you got, of course, the Stephen King adaptation of Rose Red, the TV miniseries, which was supposed to be his Hill House, which is interesting in its own terms. But I mean, the part about Eleanor is, when they go through the history of Hill House in the book anyway, there's nothing that really suggests that it's haunted, really, if you think about it. I mean, the whole history of Hill House is like, Crane builds his house. His daughter, his two daughters live there. His first wife dies on the way there. Then he remarries and they go to Europe. Then they die over in Europe, so leaving the two daughters in Hill House themselves. One sister gets married, a bit like Eleanor's story here. There's one sister gets married and carries on. The other sister stays in the house. She takes in a maid or a nurse or whatever. Obviously, they became close. And when the sister dies, the house goes to the nurse. And then, which creates a great big rift between the nurse and the other sister who's still alive. So the simple fact that it goes to court, the nurse, was able to obtain the property, and then basically have the sister outside the gate yelling abuse at her. And then
throwing stones at her.
and the only really suggestion that you have really is that the nurse thinks that someone's coming in and stealing stuff out of the house, which, could be her own paranoia, or maybe the sister is. But then when they said that when the nurse finally does die, after she hangs herself, then they said that they did an inventory and everything was still there. Nothing was missing from the house.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much all you have. And until you got, it passes on to Luke Sanderson's family, and then they rent it and people don't stay in the house very long.
Yeah.
So there might be a hinting of any kind of haunting before that there. And so it's kind of interesting that outside of that, you don't really have a lot of history about any kind of hauntings or ghostly beings around Hill House. Not in your traditional sense.
Yeah, it's just kind of, it's just a strong illusion that it's just a bad house. And Dr. Montague even calls it a place of concealed ill will. That's kind of what he thinks. I thought that was interesting when you were talking about the sisters. Think about how that thread, I just really remembered that Eleanor and her sister hate each other. And they're basically, Eleanor's basically sleeping on a cot in her sister's house when she gets the invite to Hill House. Then we hear about the two Crane sisters, who were battling, the younger sister and the older one, and how bad things went there. And then you have Eleanor and Theo, who are kind of like sisters. Yeah. And that actually, there's a funny little sister moment. The word sisters is uttered in the movie in a kind of a witty moment, and they end up having some conflict, although there's some real caring there and some their relationship really ended up being a relationship. Yeah.
Well, I found quite interesting with Theo and Eleanor in the book. I think it's, I might be wrong, but I think it's Eleanor that mentioned sisters, and Theo goes, no, cousins.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah,
which is kind of an interesting. I don't know how much, because the thing is, we don't really know what Theo's, powers are. What does she really see? I mean, we in the book we do get more that she does the card trick where she can guess so many cards. One time she's at 100%, and most of the time she's about 80 to 100%. So it looks like
so she's like clairvoyancy, but she is. I feel like she's very naive, just as much as, because the doctor again is the one who's like, so reviewing your files, the reason why I picked you is because you're clairvoyant, and she doesn't dispute it. But when he turns to Eleanor and says, well, you can feel out poltergeist, she's like, what are you talking about? And then he recalls the incident. She's like, no, that wasn't that. That was something else. Well,
Theo doesn't go to the house for any kind of psychic phenomena. Theo goes there to run away from a relationship, sort of thing.
And a holiday, basically. She's like, oh, it's a holiday. Oh.
And I think Theo, it's implied that Theo's the kind of person, if things don't go her way, she just runs away from the situation. And that's what brings her to Hill House. And I mean, it's quite funny, but Hill House, all the characters are running away from something. None of them are running towards anything. They're just running away from something.
Yeah. I think the only one who runs to that place is obviously the professor, or the doctor, because he wants to actually study and do or have a finding. And he's using these people to kind of figure that out. So.
Well, with Montague, as far as the psychological presence in the book is concerned, you get the impression that, he's got the name professor, but that's all he has. He doesn't actually have the work of a professor. It just seems to be, especially when his wife shows up and pretty much decimates him in front of everybody, every chance he can get, which is quite an interesting feat in itself. But as far as the haunting goes, another thing I think, you got to remember the house is all built on different angles. And, And at one point I said, it's like being on a ship that's, going through a storm sort of situation. And so you're kind of wondering if the haunting, with the people that didn't stay in the house, is it because they just became disoriented because of the different angles and everything?
Yeah.
It could be a lot said, with vibrations in the house and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So in effect, it might not be so much as a haunting as more psychological illusions of Eleanor that you're really experiencing.
Yeah, because she almost like passes out over the tower because she's leaning up to look at it, and she doesn't realize that she's losing her center of gravity. She just like, so it wasn't something was pushing her. It was just that it was like, oh, what, the angle, and she almost fell off. But it's definitely interesting because if you look at other moguls of that time in that era who built houses, there's a guy upstate New York. I'll have to figure out what his name is, but he owned a train company. And he was very recluse, and he built this mansion on top of a hill, and it's now a museum, so you can actually go and check it out. But he had built it deliberately at certain angles, so it's a 2-story house. And when you go up to the second story, he would look down on his guests, but his guests couldn't see him. So he deliberately built these angles in a certain way to kind of watch his guests, because he was just very recluse, and that's the type of person he was. But you think the owner of this, Crane, he built this house, and did he deliberately build it that way because he wanted that uneasiness to set? And we obviously learned too that he had such a control over his children in that way that, he was a controlling type of guy. I guess that comes out more in the film, obviously. But
that absence of right angles would really disorient and unnerve anyone, really. And it sounds like that's a big part of the anti-attraction of Hill House, is that it just feels wrong. It's a house of wrongness.
Yeah. And it also pits people against one another. I think the interesting thing about the book that I don't think it translates as much, excuse me, it translates as much into the film is the attitudes flip-flop, especially between Eleanor and Theo, that they're nice, they love each other, and the next minute it's like, I hate her, I wish she would die, and it's like, what is going on? And is that the house? Is that how the attitude is just the energy is causing them to change and shift so quickly, because it's within chapters that happens. So,
well, I mean, I think they only spend about, what is it, not even 2 weeks in the house, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a week, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty short.
But I mean, I guess it is a bit, disconcerting when you can't leave a door open. I mean, that
it just shuts on you. Prop that sucker at one point. We're gonna nail this thing open. I was like, yeah.
I mean, I find the funniest thing my favorite characters in the book is Dudley, Mrs. Dudley. I mean, she's my favorite. Everything about her is just, strictly to the point, no fuss. It's just what it is. And outside of, and then you take Mrs. Dudley and the way she acts in the book, and then you don't get Mr. Dudley except for Eleanor's approach to the house. And I always kind of wonder, like, what is their marriage like? It's like, which is quite weird, because Mr. Dudley is pretty much like, if you see a lot of English films, you always have like these odd characters, and what they would call the commoners or East End characters, and Mr. Dudley kind of fits in that. You can picture him down at the pub, having a pub, and the wife's just at home with no nonsense. And
he's in the guard shack hanging out, and she's in the house, which I find interesting. The most intimidating area is the house, right? And the woman is in there, and the man is outside. And granted, it's like groundskeeper, he's got that type of role, but I just find it interesting that he wouldn't be like, yeah, you can't go in there. It's like, oh, we need a job. You're going to go in there because you can do that. I'm going to be out here opening the gates.
but Mrs. Dudley seems to feel like it's okay if she's there during the day. She leaves before the day comes. Remember, in the night, in the dark, she will not be there. And she makes sure in the movie, particularly, it's very funny. She's like, in the night, in the dark, and she tells everybody that I'm out of here. See you later. I'll see you. Yeah, if you're still around, is the subtext there.
I was telling what I was going to say with the movie. It's funny because she reminds me of Cloris Leachman when she does Young Frankenstein. It's just, yeah,
it's great.
The thing is I find with, in the book, it's kind of weird because what you have is you got Professor Montague, don't discuss anything with the village. And, of course, no one does mention anything in the village, and I mean, even when you have the interaction with Eleanor in the village, nothing's mentioned of Hill House. You know, she goes out there and you got Dudley, playing with her to a certain extent. And then you got Mrs. Dudley who's playing with her as well, sort of thing. And I always kind of wondered, like, did they really believe there was anything there, or is it just their way of just like, these people are idiots, they're city folks, let's mess with them, because there could be an element there, a bit like Deliverance to a certain extent without the squeal like a piggy boy, but that kind of
Well, we also know the villagers kind of hated that house anyways because of the person who was it Mary? Was her name? The caretaker. So they didn't like her because, again, it was like she got this house, and was abandoning that little village life,
Well, you get small town mentality that goes on. If something happens and someone goes above their station in a small town, the town slowly turns against that person. Okay, if you go into a town and you got money and everyone, let's say, are fishermen or something like this, the town's not going to really be too friendly with the person with money. Then also, if you got someone who's one of your own and they do better, that also creates a bit of because you're basically jumping, your social status to a certain extent. And there's a lot of jealousy that goes on within a small community.
Yeah. Well, and Shirley wrote about, I hope it's okay that I'm calling her Shirley. I just feel like
she's going to haunt you now for that. She's going to be like, why did you call me Shirley?
But note her, those 3 books in a row. She did kind of like an old Dark House trilogy. She did The Haunting of Hill House, The Sundial, was it? The Haunting of Hill House, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Each one features a large house with eccentric people living or even temporarily within, and then a village below that, with kind of rocky relation. And We Have Always Lived in the Castle, the relationship is very, very rocky. So it's kind of like a little trilogy. And Shirley was always writing about, like, Mr. Dudley. He's just a classic awful Shirley Jackson character that she did. She characterized them so beautifully. They're just suspicious and mean and bigoted and small-minded, and sometimes they just practice malice against people just to do it. It's like
Keith, you mentioned the guy in the lottery, the older man.
Yeah, the old man in the lottery.
Old man
wanted this way.
And if you want really awful, in her first novel, The Road Through the Wall, almost everybody in that book is just awful. It's a great nasty satire of
being stuck in a cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
But but even the characters that come across as somewhat nicer. She has a short story, if I can remember the name, but basically it's about this woman living in an apartment complex, and this older woman keeps going in and stealing her stuff, and she knows about it, and she goes and visits the woman, and the woman's like very kind about it, but there's always this underneath cuttingness to everything, and you always get and you do always seem to have the Eleanor is overly polite, but with Eleanor, there is a passive aggressiveness to Eleanor.
Because she externalizes one thing but internalizes another thing. So she's nice because she feels like she has to, but inside she's like, are they looking at me? Are they talking about me? And she's always constantly giving you 2 sides of her. That it's very interesting from a writer's perspective, because usually you get a lot of internalization and less external, but it's sort of equal because you get both sides of the story from her.
Eleanor she's always in watching herself and watching everybody around her. Like, she's watching herself interacting with other people.
Yeah.
When she's first meeting them, she's thinking to herself, these are my friends and I'm fitting in. This is going great.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is I know in my life, if I met a Theodora, in that situation especially, I'd be obsessed with wanting her to like me. And Eleanor, it's funny, to a degree, she's cool with it, but the slightest thing that Theo does that's a little because Theo's kind of selfish, and and Eleanor just immediately notes that, and I'm thinking, again, that sister thing, I think she equates Theo kind of with her sister, and Eleanor kind of remains unto Eleanor herself and no one else, really. Really the house kind of becomes, her main passion, more than
Well,
the people.
it's the one thing I think is a constant that she thinks wants her, right? Because she's always doubtful of everyone else wanting her to be there, and then it becomes true towards the end. They really say you need to go.
Yeah.
So it's the one constant that the house, it knows my name, it knows me, and it wants and knows. She's both scared and she's intrigued because it's it knows me, but it wants me, you know.
And the house doesn't do mean things to her the way Theo does. I mean, and you know what I mean? Like, you know, Theo does, you know, she's really mean to her.
She's really bad.
but at the same time, you know, one of the funny things about this book too is you actually like the characters, you know, and you can't say that about a lot of Shirley Jackson.
Yeah.
A lot of them you really, really don't like. And the Sundial, they're all unpleasant. You know, the Road Through the Wall, they're terrible. Nahandi and Palehouse, even Theo, like as I said before, she does absolutely show concern and caring when she sees that Eleanor is flipping out and really disintegrating. You know, she's very concerned, and she even talks about, oh, can we still have our picnic?
And she also treats her like a kid because she wants it, like the picnic thing, like, let's go on an adventure. And they hold hands and they're running through the house or they're running through the brook, and they're always like, as like, again, what sisters would be like. But there's always, and I think Keith, you mentioned this before in a past conversation, that it's as if the moment the spotlight is off of Theo, she gets biting, you know.
It's all about Theo with Theo. It's always about her. But with Eleanor, it's always about Eleanor in her own way too.
But in her mind, she won't ever. That's what I mean. It's interesting that she doesn't snap. I feel personally, I don't feel like she snaps as much in the book than she does in the movie, because there are moments where she's just like, you know, in the book, it's, oh, okay. Inside, she's like, oh, you know, I'm not taking this, and I don't know, you know, and she goes internally, she goes off.
Yeah.
Well, another thing, I mean, with Eleanor, I mean, there's going to be some social retardation going on there anyway. I mean, if you take, you know, if you put it into realistic terms, you know, if something happens and a family member gets sick, and you have the sister that has to stay behind and forgive her life so the other ones can live on and stay with the family. And, you know, and there was, you know, and at the time that this was written and when this was going on, there wasn't the social support groups at that time. So you basically just shut in with the parent figure. Yeah. And as you know, like, you know, Thanksgiving, Christmas time, the family all gets together. And what you'll find with the families, they all revert back to family ties as they were growing up. Everyone reverts back to their, you know, childhood
role, right?
Childhood role. Now, picture if you never actually escaped that, and you just lived with that the whole life. And I mean, Eleanor's got to be like, what, in her 30s?
Yeah, I would say about 32.
Yeah. And she's never had social contact. There's no friends. There's no relationship that we ever heard of. I mean, it's, you know, from what we can gather. So when she does go into this situation, she's kind of out of her depth on a social psychological level.
Yeah.
You know,
but early on, she does really well. I mean, she's witty, and you know, when they're sitting by the fire and he's telling the story, I mean, she does very well. Yeah. It's just that when her name starts showing up on the walls mysteriously and stuff, that's when all that jinx.
One of my favorite lines is that it's when they all are kind of have first met and they're together, and it's oh, you must be. She says something like, oh, I must be. No, Theo's wearing silk and I am wearing tweed, so I must be Eleanor. So it's like they all are establishing their roles, but then outside of that, it's like, well, who are you? And they all create these fantasies, and it's very it's humorous, and she goes along with it. So if it was socially awkward, she would literally just say, "I took care of my mom and I was at home." Like she went along with it. She was like, oh, I have this little cottage and it's beautiful. You know, like she went along with it. I forget what, I think she called Theo like, she's like a governess or princess or something like that. Or
yeah. Well, she does all kinds of, I think this is probably as good a time as any. I wanted to discuss this, that Shirley used symbolism a lot in her work. And one of my very favorite parts of the book, and again, this is so much of the book that it's not the spooky stuff that I love. It's all this other stuff.
The whimsical.
Yeah. Well, I love her journey to Hill House, where she meets. It's funny have you read the book really recently or?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
You know how she meets, like, just right off the gate, she runs into this little old lady and knocks her down accidentally.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and the little old lady, Eleanor makes good with her, and she basically pays her cab fare home or something, and the old woman says, well, I'll be praying for you, dearie. And it's almost like I feel like she's a more forgiving version of the mother. And then she goes and stops for coffee because this is the first time she's ever been free, and she's out in the world, and she wants to extend this journey as long as she possibly can. So she stops to have lunch, and there's a little girl there, and Eleanor overhears. This is the famous passage. This is one a lot of people remember very fondly. The little girl will not drink her milk because it's not from her cup of stars. And the mother explains to the waitress, well, see, she has this cup and there's these little stars at the bottom and she can see the stars, blah, blah, blah. And the mother's like, so just, this is once, why don't you drink the milk from the non-cup, and when you get home, you can have your cup of stars. And Eleanor has this wonderful moment of empathy. She kind of looks at the little girl. She's like, yeah, don't do it. Do not drink from that.
Yeah.
When you do that, you will lose. It's like you will lose your individuality. They'll get rid of the cup, so you'll be more obedient. And then the little girl kind of intuits what Eleanor is saying to her silently and doesn't drink it. She says, nope, not doing it. Yeah. And Eleanor's like, yeah, wise, brave girl. There's even a website called Wise, Brave Girl. Like, that's totally, predicated on that little passage. So I almost feel like, okay, so she runs into a mom figure who's kind of nice to her instead of being nasty. Then this little girl's maybe what could have been her, and so she's just kind of like, yeah, be an individual. Don't be like me. Don't get stuck doing what I got stuck with.
Yeah.
And then later she stops in Hillsdale for a cup of coffee, and she meets this girl who's basically stuck, just like Eleanor has been. And Eleanor talks to her a little bit, and basically you get the sense that this girl is just kind of she's never gonna rise above her crummy life in this crummy town, and that's what Eleanor could become. And this is what right now Eleanor is leaving. She's leaving that behind. So I feel like there's those three women are symbols, different varying symbols that are really relevant to Eleanor. Yeah. And then that cup of stars is her symbol for something better,
Yeah.
And she references the cup of stars several times later.
It's also a use she never had, because like that girl gave her something back. By her not doing that, it gave her a sense of like, I want to be a kid again. I want to have my cup of stars. Like I want to, and so she uses it. It's weird how she manifests things, or she sees things and she manifests it in what her life could be. And so she kind of says, oh, this is my life, with the matching lions, outside of my little house and my little
fictional house. Yeah. And there's also just the connect. She actually makes this really lovely connection with that little girl. There's a little moment of mutual understanding. It's a really nice moment, and I can see why I have always remembered it, and it's kind of a famous little passage and a non-ghostly thing. It's just
Well, what's also interesting about the Cup of Stars is that when it's first mentioned, when you first start reading, and the Cup of Stars comes up, and then basically you think maybe it's a cup with stars around the outside or something like that, but then you realize is that it's at the bottom of the cup. So as you drink and you move your head forward, you see the stars reaching out for the stars. So you have that symbolism reaching there, which, I mean, now it's become like a 1980s, catchphrase on calling card from Hallmark, reach for the stars. But at the time, I mean, I don't think it was, it all symbolizes, reach for what your potential is, reach for your stars. And, as you were saying, Eleanor is reaching for her potential. She's, finally for the first time she has her life. She didn't have a life before. She's actually moving towards a life. It might be a horrible life, but it's going to be her life. It's not going to be something that's been preordained by her mother or predestined by her sister or even the niece that she bloody hates. I mean, when you first read this, you think, oh my gosh, she really hates children. But then you do, because she really hates her niece. In the movie, she's irritated by her. In the book, she hates her niece. But but you do get, it's kind of, there, those three passages, as you were saying, are very, very interesting. What I also found funny about the older woman when she drops her groceries, obviously, I don't know if she got them from the food bank or where she got them. I know she didn't pay for that food, but when Eleanor pays her to go take the cab ride home, and she goes, "Oh, that will be such and such plus a friendly tip," and and she's like, and it goes to the point about, the cab driver goes, "Where are you going?" And cab driver kind of knows where she's going. Obviously, I think it's only like a block away. I don't think it's that far. It's almost like, but that whole scene is with Shirley Jackson. There's always this wry humor that kind of goes through all her characters. Yeah, because even like the simple fact with the a couple of stars sort of thing, you got the waitress, and there's a bit of a wry humor that's going on, even with the waitress. Even the most minute characters all have a shining spark that that really investigates the social pleasantries, but what's underneath those social pleasantries at the same time, and how Eleanor fits in there. And as you said, I didn't realize this before, but what you did say, that they are the three stages of Eleanor. There's the future, there's the letting go of the past, and have and could be of what the future might be, or if she did.
Well, she wrote, I think, in that book, Let Me Tell You, the one that came out a couple years ago, another collection of her fiction and essays. I think it was called Garlic and Fiction, and she talked about how that whole passage is very tricky, that she wanted to use those symbols like the cup of stars, but use them really sparingly so she doesn't get too precious and doesn't, overwhelm the passage is the way she put it. It's a short essay, but it's really fascinating. I mean, anytime she wrote about her writing, it was always so edifying to read because, I think she really understood readers and what they will put up with, what they can reach for, and I don't know. I'm babbling.
No,
Shirley was a great writer.
I mean,
she just needed to get to the heart. She just, I know that if you look at a lot of writers today or writers in the past, they flower everything up to a certain point that a lot of things get lost. But Shirley would write, and with any of us, especially Hill House, she wrote what was necessary.
Yeah.
You guys, you were exactly how to word it and how to put it and how to display it, and it was just what was necessary. But you got everything. If a character and nothing was flourished, if there was a character and the character said good morning, they could say one line good morning a certain way that she would describe, and never say anything else. But you would know that whole history of that character from that one good morning.
Yeah. Did you ever read her story in the Lottery and Other Stories? It's called A Fine Old Firm. And it is literally two women. A woman comes and visits another woman, and they have this brief conversation about their sons. And nothing is ever said overtly. Yeah. But you really get the sense that the woman who's dressed in a smart coat is subtly dismissing this other woman. It's Shirley, it's funny. You guys were talking. I listened to your podcast on the Silence of the Lambs yesterday just to prepare for this, and you guys were talking about how Thomas Harris doesn't really describe his character's physicality, and I think that I thought, Shirley doesn't really do that either. Mm-hmm. She gives you the broad strokes, and then she fills it in with the reader almost through dialogue and her plainer description. Do you know? I mean, she tells you, well, Eleanor has short brown hair, and Theodora has luxuriously black hair, and Luke is a blonde, handsome man. I mean, you just kind of go with like what they say and how others react to them, and you get a full sketch of, she sketches it in, and then you fill it in along with her almost.
Yeah. It's like it's what you say, not how you say, but in this case, it is quite literally what you say, because she uses the words as a way, a vice to stab, especially with Theo. Like, Theo has the best one-liners that I think I've ever heard, and it's clear measures of hurting And then there's clear measures of playfulness between Nell and Theo at certain times and how they speak to each other like sisters, but you don't have to say they're sisters. Or it's how the words come across. And like I think even with Luke, the making the martinis or something, you could tell he's kind of a playboy and suave. But again, she doesn't paint it like he's wearing this and the hair is coiffed and all this. It's just that line where I make a mean martini and Theo's like, we'll see about that, or whatever that line is. It's, you get to see that sort of character for what they are through their dialogue.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the only really thing that she really says about Theo, the only description that you really get is that she's cat-like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's only like when she's laying in front of the fire and she's draped herself across the sofa with her legs over the arm of the chair and she's laying there cat-like. And that's pretty much all. I mean, I think that's probably the only description of Theo that you get. All of Theo is basically, you just have it painted in your mind. And, and it's quite funny because Eleanor's old school. And then you got Theo, who's like new, I guess you can only look like, Hollywood, and I always picture Eleanor looking like Miss Marple.
Yeah. Well, and there's a line, the line I just came to mind was when they're painting each other's nails. Mm. And at first, Nell is fine and she likes it. And then she just gets mortified and then it's dirty. And my feet are dirty. And it doesn't really say that they're dirty as in like dirt dirty. It's more like, is it dirty because of the color red and it's red and it's dirty? And is that a moral thing? Is it like for her, it's like, oh, I can't have red on my toenails. That's, and she doesn't want to use the words that are other words, but she'll use the word dirty, and that's a pretty negative connotation.
In Shirley's fiction, she dirty was used very often. It was the worst thing anything could be. It was dirty.
Yeah.
In a lot of her other stories.
Well, I mean, that does come, when they go, I think it's the nursery, that, that theme brings up again when they go to the nursery and they find the book of Crane's for his daughter, with all the,
religious,
the lessons of life that his daughter should learn.
little bedtime story.
Which is quite weird because the thing is that Eleanor takes it, Eleanor doesn't get upset by it. She's okay with that book. It's Theo that is mortified and she's basically horrorized by the whole book. Everything about it, I mean, Luke's kidding around with it and it's Theo the one who's going, you need to stop. And but then, I mean, in the book, it's kind of mentioned in the film, of course, they do it a bit more overtly, but, whether now I have to tie in with what Theo's sexuality is, if it is what it is, whether she's close to her flatmate, but they doesn't really say. And I mean, I know in the film, what we get to later, I mean, it is mentioned a lot more overtly about Theo's sexuality, but, in the book, it's not really mentioned. And I know that I read Shirley Jackson's A Haunted Life, and there's been quite a few instances where, they say that some of Shirley's characters were gay or lesbian, and Shirley's always kind of denied it. It's like, no, so it'd be quite but in Hill House, maybe it has something to do with that, with the simple fact that it's unclean, unnatural, all that kind of stuff, in that book. So when Luke's going through the book, maybe it does hit a nerve with Theo at that point. So in that case, Theo's not as polished as she comes across.
Yeah. And she's obviously like, she kind of, I think she always treads that line of as being a believer and unbeliever, right? And then when you get into religion, which is kind of what that book represents, is like it's, Crane's version of the Bible, basically, for his kids. She just rips it apart, and she's just like, and I think I don't know if the same line that was in the movie, but where she's just like, "You can burn in hell, Crane," for the, and it's just like, wow, okay, she's not having it.
Which, I mean, but it also could symbolize the simple fact that Eleanor, as far as, the fire and brimstone, Southern Baptist version of religion, I suppose, that maybe it didn't affect Eleanor because maybe that's what she's used to.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
You really,
Who knows what her mother was, who drummed into her. You have no idea, but it probably wasn't good,
Yeah.
From the hammering on the wall when she needed her pills. I mean, that's pretty much all you really know about Eleanor's mother, which, I mean, in itself is a pretty horrific image. I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah. And the thing too is, if you've read enough of Shirley Jackson's other books, those devouring mothers, one of her archetypes that I did a comic about. They're generated. They're willful, and there's that archetype is willful and devouring and really hard to be around. And I think it's strongly you get a strong indication that Eleanor's mom was one of those devouring mothers.
Well, I think that also is, art imitating life to a certain extent. If you know anything about Shirley Jackson's real life, and it's not hidden that her and her mother had quite the relationship. It's kind of like anything that Shirley did was never good enough. If Shirley was had her picture in a paper, her mother would write to her, it's like, do you have to get that fat? Or, have you...
God.
But she wouldn't say, have you got that fat? She'd be like, it'd be like, have you thought about, going on a diet? And it'd always be...
Again, it's the words, because, again, you use the words, and those words can be daggers,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no one could be nastier than a Shirley Jackson mom or villager.
It's weird how they how it's replicative in the fact that the grandmother, the mother died the same way that the daughter of Crane died the same way, and how that maybe Eleanor relates to that, and it's that sort of thing, like, relates to the house even more because of that, because it's like it's predestined. It's like kismet that I meant to come to this house because that daughter had the same fate, and maybe that's maybe I'm here for that reason.
Again, it's just those links, the sisters and the Crane sisters, and Eleanor and Theo, and Eleanor and her sister, and the companion thing with the old lady, banging on the door. It's the same thing. It's like why else would if the house did indeed choose Eleanor? Yeah. Choosing for a reason, the house knows, oh yeah, this is another gal who feels guilty about perhaps not
being there for her mom.
Not being there because she's a bad daughter.
But Eleanor, I don't think you killed your mother.
Yeah.
I have to sit there and say, the Luke character is quite an interesting character. It's kind of like, well, in England they would call him the Jack the Lad character. It's in the book, of course. It's I guess it's assumed that Theo would find Luke sexually or physically attractive, which I have to say, when they finally do have a conversation, she's like, what a man child. Exactly. Just disseminates him pretty much in her mind. She's pleasant to his face, but Theo uses Luke as a pawn a lot of times. It's like, when they're going, when they're walking through the garden or the field, or depending on how big Hill House land is, really. But they're walking along, and then Theo and Eleanor basically had their kind of a bit of a falling out, and Theo's like gripping onto Luke's arm, and it's like just talking and leaving Eleanor out of the situation.
Yeah.
Deliberately.
Yeah. Well, didn't she also, in the beginning of that sort of relationship, wasn't she Theo was an instigator to, like, oh, I think he likes you.
Yeah.
He's got eyes for you.
And if you think of the simple fact with the age difference, in the time that this is written, the time that it's set, Eleanor is a spinster. Plain and simple. If you weren't married by the age of 20, you were a spinster.
Yeah.
I had to sit there and say, wearing the tweed probably didn't help the whole spinster look either.
Yeah.
But,
that kind of completed the ensemble, didn't it? The whole,
and then when Theo had to wear that outfit, those outfits, I'm rocking the tweed now.
But so when Theo does this sort of thing, there is there is an evilness to Theo. The simple fact that she, Luke, I say that he's supposed to be about between 20 and 25. We're assuming, you got Eleanor's, the late 30s.
Yeah.
And it's like, he likes you and all this kind of stuff. And, it's kind of cruel to a certain extent. But then again, maybe, she's trying to feel out what kind of, place Eleanor has inside her mind, sort of things like, can she take a joke? Can she not take a joke? And sometimes when people do meet, they do test the waters, see what you can get away with each person that you meet.
I think she also became a little bit more meaner when her clothes were ruined. And I don't know if it ever really.
You're wearing designer outfits, and all of a sudden you got to start.
Well, it's also, isn't that sort of metaphorical that she has to step into Eleanor's clothes, like literally step into her life, and that to Theo, that's like, I'm not going to be her, like I'm me, and and that I don't know if she insinuated that it was like she felt Eleanor was the reason her clothes got destroyed, but I feel like she blamed her.
I figured that it probably was like Eleanor unconsciously, attacking her back, like again, I really think that Eleanor is kind of the root of all these manifestations in the house. That again, she may be doing it unconsciously by herself. She may be doing it with the house's help. We just don't really know. I mean,
remember,
to your own satisfaction.
Did you ever watch the episode of The Twilight Zone where it's a kid who can manifest anything?
Oh yeah,
he's like super omnipotent that he can just like make people disappear, make things reappear. Like I immediately thought of her being like that. Like she would just do something and not knowing that she did it, but it's almost like it manifests because of the lions being there. Did she manifest those lions being there? Like stuff like that. It made me think about that.
Yeah. And what I suddenly realized too is that if she was able to do this stuff, note that why didn't her nasty sister at home ever get red substance all over her clothes or whatever? I think she like needs Hill House to do this, or maybe that's like you mentioned Stephen King's Carrie a little while ago, and maybe like Carrie's first menstrual period kind of awakened her powers, and maybe Eleanor being in Hill House has awakened this or reawakened it, because we know that this poltergeist activity happened in her childhood, and the reader pretty much intuits that it was Eleanor, was the root of that too.
Yeah.
With a troubled home life, because that's what happens with poltergeists, right? I mean, they're manifested, that activity is manifested when there's conflict, emotional conflict with children, in the household.
Well, I mean, another thing is, if you take the paranormal out of those stories, Eleanor could have written on the wall herself.
That's true.
Because the thing is, in the story, and it's the way the story is written. When it's written on the wall, Eleanor comes down to breakfast on her own, and then she's having breakfast, and then all of a sudden Luke comes down afterwards. So that's one time that Eleanor's on her own, and then you have the Eleanor, on the wall. Another thing is there's a lot of space in between about what's actually going on, so you're not quite sure how they are filling up their day. You go to lunch, but there's these empty spaces, so you don't know if they're stuck together or. And Eleanor could have simply just gone upstairs and ruined Theo's clothes, because it is after the toe painting incident. And you have the red of the toenail and then the red of the clothes, and that supposed to look like blood, but it's not blood. Yeah.
But doesn't it, like towards the end, everything is fine? So it's really weird. It's almost like, oh, never mind. There's nothing wrong with my clothes. They're fine now. And it sort of comes and goes. So again, it's weird. It's like a manifestation.
It's just supernatural stuff. She does, again, there's all kinds of odd little passages. Like I know a lot of people, myself included, were mystified. Do you know this scene later when they're out in the woods and Eleanor said they're getting frightened, they're really angry with each other, but they're kind of sticking together and they're getting scared, and suddenly Eleanor at least sees this picnic. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
And she sees this family having this picnic, and it's bright and sunny all of a sudden. And then we cut to Theodora screaming and saying, just run. And so they run. And to me, I guess when I've thought about that little picnic scene, that odd thing, it's just some kind of a nuclear family vision of something Eleanor's never had, dropped in there. And then they never talk about what it was that Theodora saw that was so frightening. But I thought that was a really interesting passage, and one of the more, again, Shirley was a literary writer on top of writing popular fiction. I mean, this book is a real nice mix of the two,
Yeah. Well,
that stuff is there if you want it.
If Theo did see a nuclear family, that would probably horrify her and make her run the other way.
Like, no way, run for your life. It always is weird.
Children.
What always boggled me is that in those instances, right after those things happen, every instance that happens, they kind of just wasn't that fun? And you're like, what? Yeah. If it was terrifying, I would be like, no, get me the hell out of here. They kind of just, it's an adventure. Isn't this adventurous? Oh, didn't it scare you? Oh my God, that's so much fun. And you're like, what?
Well, that's what you kind of get with the relationships. I mean, with Professor Montague, I mean, what you basically have is, I mean, she mentioned it multiple times that he's the father and they're the kids.
Yeah.
And when you get to the simple fact that if you remember when you were kids, you like to scare each other, and there's never anything there, but you would scare each other. We used to play in a cemetery because it was next door to my house, and we used to go in there and play, and we used to freak ourselves out, and that was part of the fun. But it was all a matter of suggestion. And the professor, he does do a lot of manner of suggestions, like, oh, this house is haunted and da 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 da. And he's planting ideas in these three's heads.
Yeah.
And almost the fact that then, they drop down to the child thing. So when, that classic woods scene when they're running through and Eleanor sees this, we don't see what Theo is, but then Theo could just be playing on, come on, I'm scared. And, and like two girls when they're going, I'm scared, and they go running off pretending they're scared.
Yeah.
That's true. And then eventually they do become scared because they frighten themselves. So there could be an element of that, or there could have been something supernatural. That's why this book, I think this book works on so many levels, because you can look at it from a paranormal way and all this stuff happening, or maybe it's none of this is happening. Maybe it's take all the paranormal out and look at it from that kind of view, and it plays on the psychological aspect of it. So
yeah.
Maybe that's a good segue to the movie. Maybe we should discuss the movie, because I think that's the movie takes a very particular route.
Yes.
The book, and I can't wait to see this miniseries you're talking about, because maybe they can preserve all those little
nuances, right?
Surely that the novel has. I hope they can.
Yeah.
Laurence Jackson Hyman is the son of the respected author of Shirley Jackson and the esteemed literary critic Stanley Edgar Hyman. He is an accomplished jazz musician, editor, publisher, photographer, and former president of the Woodford Press and Crescendo Studios. It is thanks to Mr. Hyman and his siblings that has kept Shirley Jackson's work alive. Hello, Laurence. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Keith. A pleasure.
First question is, inspiration for the house used in The Haunting of Hill House was from a picture Shirley Jackson found in a magazine that she thought was hideous and evil-looking. Can you share with us the story about the house?
Well, there are actually many stories about possible influences for the house in that novel. A picture postcard that disturbed Shirley, published photographs of haunted Victorian mansions. She even wrote once about seeing a building on 125th Street in New York as she was arriving by train with my father. That so horrified her that she couldn't bear to see it again, so the return trip had to be switched to a night train. A New York friend she asked to research it for her told her weeks later that it had been very hard to find, as it was only visible from that precise angle that Shirley had seen it from, and the inside had burned badly during a fire that killed 9 people. And he reported that the neighborhood children he talked to all were convinced it was haunted. The postcard, though, was part of a private collection of fine black and white and sepia cards gathered over years by a wealthy English traveler who loved historical houses, given as a gift to Shirley by Stanley. There were chateaux and castles and grand manors in France, England, and the U.S., and many of them were famous haunted houses. Shirley wrote about these postcards in a story we included in Let Me Tell You, entitled The Ghosts of Loire. Shirley said that she sometimes saw figures in some of the houses, though often not. and sometimes they would move slightly or wave. I own 3 of the cards, including the supposed charmed one of Laurence. But in this collection, there was also a card showing a mansion in California that Shirley felt was disfigured and evil-looking. She wrote to her mother asking about the house and finally learned from her mother that the horrible house had actually been one of many designed by Shirley's great-grandfather, architect Samuel Bugby, who built many San Francisco mansions. Her mother said the house was so despised that the neighbors eventually assembled one night and burned it down. When I was a teenager, Shirley often asked me to drive her around Vermont and upper New York State in her Morris Minor convertible to look for old spooky houses. She loved houses in real life. We found some grand ones, and Shirley would just stare at them for a few minutes and take them in. We always lived in large, even huge, old New England houses with lots of character, and both my parents loved them. We all did. But Hill House was a totally made-up house, a composite of many. I have some diagrams Shirley drew of the interiors of Hill House while she was writing the novel, so she could keep it all straight. Of course, the house was a very central character here, as in many other Jackson novels.
That's really interesting. I grew up in northern New York, and I have to sit there and say that driving around looking at houses, that's what we tend to do on the weekends when I was growing up.
Yeah, well, there are lots of beauties, or it used to be. I don't know if they're still as plentiful as they used to be.
Yeah.
So many people have moved into that part of the country.
Yeah.
But in those days, there were the old deserted houses that we would find that, the windows were broken and they were really quite wonderful looking.
Well, Miss Jackson's work always works on multiple levels, which are psychological and character studies. Did she look at life in this way, or was this strictly saved for the pages?
Oh, this was her style of writing. She was a wonderful storyteller and carefully crafted her prose. Her writing is spare and to the point and very descriptive, yet much of it can be read on various levels. Shirley was extremely well-read and knowledgeable about classical literature, mythology, myth and ritual, the tarot, fairy tales, psychoanalysis, dream analysis, hypnosis. She was influenced by many other things, including the Oz books, the Marx Brothers, the blues, demonology. But when she sat down at the typewriter, she was all business. She would type furiously for a few minutes, then pause, then another flurry. I remember it well. She used to say she was writing all the time, whether washing dishes or cooking or house cleaning. She would make up stories. And if she got something good, she kept pads and pencils stashed around the house so she could quickly write down an idea. In her papers, we found shopping lists that are word salads of plot notes for stories or novels in progress, chores, reminders, character ideas, times for children, pickups, even instructions and terse warnings to her characters.
She's also known mainly for horrific shorts and novels. She also had a fun, wicked side with a wry sense of humor. Do you think that sometimes this side of her work is sometimes missed out?
Yeah, a lot of her humorous stories were never taken as seriously as her other writing, but many of them are equally masterful. For years, she was often dismissed as a fiction writer because she also published dozens of wonderfully funny domestic chronicles about our family life. The first story she published in this unique domestic style was Charles, about me when I was 5 or 6 and starting kindergarten. Trite as it might have been, it isn't. Its seeming innocence disappears gradually as it builds with drama and finally features Shirley's trademark twist ending. Charles is one of the most anthologized short stories in U.S. high school textbooks, along with The Lottery. I've been asked about it all my life. Shirley also wrote 2 novels about our family, Life Among the Savages. I was going to say they couldn't reconcile that those same fingers on her royal typewriter could produce stories like The Lottery, as well as rhapsodies to her kitchen utensils like Here I Am Washing Dishes Again. But Shirley loved to write, and being a professional writer, and it almost didn't matter what genre she was working in. She gave every literary effort her best shot.
So what are your thoughts on Robert Wise's The Haunting, and did your mother have any views of this adaptation?
The movie is still a classic, and it holds up all these years, 55 years after it was made. Director Robert Wise did a beautiful and innovative job with it, I think. He used experimental lenses and filters in new, dramatic ways. And the movie is still spine-chilling. Shirley had understandably mixed feelings about seeing her characters come alive, saying the words she knew so well, but she was really proud and used to tell people it had really frightened her.
There's currently a new 10-part series dramatization of The Haunting of Hill House being developed for Netflix. How did this come about?
This is actually one of several new TV and movie projects based on my mother's writing. There's another TV series in the works based on her short stories, 3 movies, and a big new stage adaptation moving forward. There are also touring ballets, stage readings, an opera, numerous small theater productions, and readings of her work at all levels. It's wonderful to see so much adaptation interest these days in Shirley's work.
Shirley Jackson's work has been given birth to the modern novel and has influenced some very successful authors such as Stephen King, Neil Gaiman, Joanna Harris, Nigel Kneale, amongst others. How do you feel this wave of modern writers giving credence to her body of work?
Well, that's wonderful. Shirley has had a really enormous influence now on several generations of writers, whether professional and published or amateur. Stephen King dedicated a book to her and has called the opening paragraph of Hill House the finest in literature. Many well-known writers have sung her praises and openly admired her use of language. Last year, one of her stories in our book, Let Me Tell You, was nominated for an Edgar Allan Poe Award. She won, and that was written in 1965. She won one in 1965 for The Possibility of Evil, but otherwise she received few honors or awards in her lifetime. She had many writer friends, and there was an enormous fan base very loyal to her. I'm always amazed at the sincere admiration of her fans when I meet them.
There's been many psychological and academic studies done on your mother's work, and some very interesting theories. What are your views on this, and what do you think your mother would have made of them?
I think she'd be very pleased and wildly amused to know her work is as popular now as it was during her lifetime, and that it's taken so seriously by scholars. Shirley was generally not fond of reading reviews of her work, regardless of how positive they were. She preferred to have her writing speak for itself. She was constantly being asked about the lottery and what she meant, and her reply was always, "It's just a story." Mm-hmm. With very rare exceptions, she never discussed her finished work, preferring to talk and write about the process of creative writing. She loved to teach at writers' conferences and taught 1 or 2 short story classes at Bennington College, but generally was happiest seated at her typewriter. Her work is receiving a lot of serious attention from readers and scholars around the world now. It's almost as though she's been rediscovered 50 years after her death. She's a rising star. Every one of her books is in print, and new volumes appear. There have been a number of biographies published over the years, but last year, Ruth Franklin wrote by far the best, an excellent biography of my mother entitled Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award and consistently glowing reviews around the country. She firmly places Shirley in the rank of great 20th century writers and establishes her as one of the great American Gothic novelists of all time. Ruth painstakingly researched Shirley's papers, voluminous correspondence and journals, and I've actually learned a lot of new things about my family from her book.
It was an excellent book. I've actually read it. It was phenomenal. I'm pushing it on to everyone I meet it these days.
Great. Good.
Miss Jackson's work used ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances using psychological means. Do you think this is what keeps her body of work alive today?
Absolutely. Hers were ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, usually. She created characters and situations that are easily recognizable, shown by the fact that her work has long been published and read globally, and readers can easily relate only to be surprised on the next page. Shirley would often create pastoral scenes and situations where everything seems comfortable and right. But just underneath the surface, we slowly discover, lurks the possibility of evil. Anywhere, everywhere. That's what's so frightening about some of her work, the unexpected turn, the sudden realization that things are not what we thought they were.
Miss Jackson's work was breaking through boundaries of the 1940s and 1950s. Do you think in hindsight, being a female in a male-dominated industry may have hindered her acceptability amongst her contemporaries, and if she were male, would there have been the same boundaries set for her?
I'm sure it was a factor that since she was a woman writer, she may not have been taken as seriously as some of her contemporaries, many of them now all but forgotten. Despite publishing early and often in the New Yorker and other major literary magazines, her stories often appeared in the women's magazines of the day, actually magazines with very able fiction and large audiences. Shirley was a pre-feminist, they say, and wrote about the role of women in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s and how women adapted to the limitations and borders applied to them. She once wrote humorously, but with deadly aim, about the time she was being admitted to the hospital to give birth to my sister, and when asked her occupation by the admitting clerk, she said with some pride, writer. It was 1948, and she published her first novel. After a moment's thought, the clerk said, well, I'll just put down housewife. She knew the awards and fellowships were going to the male writers, but she refused to be daunted by it. She was very proud of being a professional writer in an industry run by men. Many of her most celebrated male contemporaries showered her with compliments.
That brings me to The Lottery. At the time, it circulated a lot of hate when first published in The New Yorker in 1968, which now is required reading in most American schools for students in the 8th grade. What are your thoughts on this?
The Lottery was a classic from the first day it was published in 1948. The story shook the literary world to its roots with its spare simplicity and deeply disturbing shock ending. My mother sometimes felt that some of her work was not taken as seriously as it could be because she was typecast as the author of The Lottery. She was asked constantly about it. It's a wonderful and moving introduction to masterful short story writing for students of all ages.
The Lottery has been turned into a well-received graphic novel. Are there any other plans of turning your mother's work into other mediums such as graphic novels or computer games?
The graphic novel adaptation you refer to was made by my oldest son, Miles Hyman, who is a professional artist who lives and works in Paris. He's lived there for decades. I think it's exceptionally good and manages to re-envision the story anew. It was published simultaneously in English and French last year and received rave reviews in both languages. I'd love to have Miles do another Jackson adaptation, but he's awfully busy these days with commissions and other graphic novels and shows in galleries and museums. He's also just been named a chevalier by the French Minister of Culture, much to his surprise and delight. But to answer your question, there are no plans at the moment for other media, but who knows?
Well, I think your mother's work really lends itself, so be excited to see what happens in the future with that.
Mm-hmm.
Your child has been immortalized in her short stories, which were published mainly in women's magazines, and then later in their own collection, Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons. What did you think of these when you were growing up, and how do you view them today?
When I would see her stories in national magazines, sometimes even with illustrations of me and my friends, it was with both embarrassment and pride. I didn't mind the attention I got, mainly from parents of my friends, but I never took any of it very seriously. Now I read her stories to my grandchildren, who love them.
There's currently a new film in post-production of We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which I believe is out of post-production now. How did this come about, and did you have any involvement in the production?
Yeah, I just viewed a finished copy of the movie the other night. It's wonderful. It was my pleasure to serve as executive producer on the film, along with Michael Douglas. I worked extensively on script with the young, talented director Stacy Passon, and am very pleased with what she's done with a very talented staff and genius cinematographer, Piers McGrail. We shot it in Ireland at a 200-year-old manor house in County Wicklow, which was just perfect. I think Shirley would have loved it. I've also been very involved in the editing, which took many months, and I'm excited about the movie. My wife and I have now watched it many times, and each time there are new things to look at. We hope for release in the coming year.
I'm really looking forward to that. It's got a fantastic cast with it as well. I mean, a really talented cast, and it's one of my favorite books as well.
Good.
Your mother's work addresses a lot of society ills that are still present today, such as the subtle racism in the fabulous short story After You, My Dear Alphonse, or more overt racism found in The Flower Garden. What do you think her views would be today in relation to whether we have progressed or not? And on a personal note, I'm very surprised that these two stories are not used as a teaching tool today. They are phenomenal shorts.
They are. Shirley was really adamantly against racism of any kind if she could recognize it, and sometimes she didn't, but kept away from political subjects in her writing. Still, she did address racism directly a few times, but it was always in the service of her story. One of my parents' dearest and oldest friends was Pulitzer Award-winning writer Ralph Ellison. He and his wife, Fanny, would often come visit us, and for months in the early 50s, Ralph lived with us in our house. And whenever he and my parents would drive out to dinner in my mother's convertible, villagers and kids would stare at the first black man they'd ever seen. This was in the 50s, even in the 60s. My parents in Bennington College nearby were a liberal, learned oasis in the middle of a cultural backwoods. Much has been written about my mother's relationship with the villagers in our tiny Vermont town, North Bennington. She depicted villagers in many ways in her books and stories, but actually in real life, Shirley was good friends with many of them, and they all admired the fact that she was becoming quite famous.
On YouTube, there are endless channels looking at your mother's work with many different views and across many generations. What are your thoughts on her crossing the generation gaps?
Well, her writing, both fiction and non, is increasingly frighteningly relevant today, a notion that is chilling in its own right. It cuts to the human condition and its perils. In her work, there's always the possibility of evil lurking just around the corner or in an unopened letter. She wrote about people and conditions that the reader can easily identify with. Stories she wrote in the 1940s through the 1960s echo the same deep fears and frights that are in such great abundance these days. She showed the ugly underside of life, often where we least expected it. She wrote in a seamless, timeless style that reads very well now. Writers of all ages have been very influenced by her work.
Shirley Jackson's work is going through a resurgence in popularity, especially here in the UK. What do you think keeps her work alive and fresh today?
Well, she's really a rising star these days, more than 50 years after her death. Several new volumes have appeared in the UK recently, and there have been good stage adaptations of both Hill House and Castle. A couple of years ago, my wife and I attended the opening of a really fine Hill House in Liverpool. I was very happy with it. And at the moment, there is serious adaptation interest going forward.
Your mother left behind a legacy through her outstanding body of work. How would you like her to be remembered?
She was a very skilled wordsmith and took her work very seriously. As my father wrote in his introduction to The Magic of Shirley Jackson, which he edited and published just following her death, he wrote, quote, "I think that the future will find her powerful visions of suffering and inhumanity increasingly significant and meaningful, and that Shirley Jackson's work is among that small body of literature produced in our time that seems apt to survive." He wrote that more than 50 years ago, and it is certainly proving true.
Excellent. Well, Laurence, thank you for joining the Literary License Podcast, and thank you for your interview.
My pleasure, and it's always fun to talk about my mother's work, frankly.
Amazon is here to make your life easier. By just the tap of a button, you can turn the camera on your phone to your own personal shopping list. Introducing Flow, Just tap the camera icon under the search bar, and you can find whatever it is you're looking for, right on Amazon. Faster than scanning a barcode and typing the name of your item into the search engine. Besides, searching with words is so 2012. Save time and money. Amazon, where shopping meets effortless.
Tonight the dead will walk, and you, unbeliever, will scream unheard.
Stop it!
The Haunting. What do we really know of that other world of hauntings, of apparitions in the night, of the sinister powers of darkness? The Haunting was produced and directed by Robert Wise, the brilliant producer of West Side Story, and stars Julie Harris, Claire Bloom, Richard Johnson, Russ Tamblyn. You cannot deny terror. You cannot look the other way. You have to face the supernatural, face the chilling mysteries of forces you cannot understand or control when The Haunting holds you in its spell. The Haunting.
Welcome back. An evil old house, the kind some people call haunted, is like an undiscovered country waiting to be explored. Hill House stood for 90 years and might stand for 90 more. Silence lay steadily against the wood and the stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. This was the opening narration Dr. Markaway gives at the start of the film of The Haunting. There are so many elements about the film I love. Hill House, in essence, is the main character of the story, and the director, Rob Weiss, did an amazing job bringing this beast of a house to life. I'd also like to say that whoever managed the casting for this film did an excellent job selecting Julie Harris, Eleanor, Claire Bloom, Theodora, and Rosalie Crutchley, is that how I pronounce right? Crutchley, Mrs. Dudley, because aside from the house, these women really brought the story to life, which is a testament to Shirley Jackson, who developed these strong female characters. One of my favorite scenes in the film also reflects the strongest theme of the story: fact versus fiction, reality versus imagination. It's when Theodora wakes up Eleanor when she hears a banging in the hallway. Now, up until this point, we and they suspend our disbelief that what has or is occurring in the house. And once the supernatural event has passed, the housemates all sort of laugh it off, and it is as if it were some hoax or some wild adventure. What's really interesting is how each of their skepticism towards the house is very different from the skepticism they have towards each other, specifically Eleanor, which made me wonder, is she the reason, that these paranormal events are occurring in the first place? It kept me guessing, which is something I feel is critically important to the audience. It's one thing to be gripped by the tension of the unknown, but the supernatural world, but it's also to have a tight-knit cast of characters play off or against one another. It creates a residue of conflict. How did you both feel about the movie?
I love the movie. I think the movie's always one of my favorites, and I watch it on a yearly basis. And whenever anyone comes over to my house and goes, let's watch a movie, I drag that out. That and The Changeling are the two of my favorite horror films. And I just, everything about it is just magnificent. I can't see any weak point in the film whatsoever. Flows at a really good rate, and it stays with you. It's one of those, a lot of films you kind of watch, and once you finish it, you move on and in the house or do your dishes and forget about it. Where The Haunting stays with you. It's always there, ingrained in your brain. You see it once, and it always stays there. It never leaves your brain.
It's haunting.
Haunting.
Pun intended. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I've always really liked the movie a lot. I'm not as in love with it because I'm really, it has to leave a lot of things out, as any film, book to film adaptation's going to do. But that's why, really quickly, I'm really excited to hear about this mini series, and I really hope that they, rather than going for sensationalism, which I don't know, we'll see. I really hope that they can put in some of that symbology stuff we were talking about with the book. Even just her journey to Hill House, if they could delineate that, that'd be great.
Yeah, because they completely negated the village and the journey.
Yeah.
Like, some of the journey, it just you got her in the car driving.
Yeah. And almost, I just watched it the other night, for Twitter. I do this thing called 31 Horror Films, 31 Days. And of course, I've seen The Haunting many, many times, but I thought I better watch it again right before this just to refresh my memory, even though I really do know the movie very well. But it really does seem like Eleanor just gets in the car and, maybe does a little country drive and she's suddenly there. It doesn't, I feel like that's one of those little flaws in a movie. And any movie you see over and over, even your favorite ones, you're going to see little things that don't come off as well,
Yeah.
But she, anyway, back to the film. I think, they could not have cast better actresses than Julie Harris and Claire Bloom to play Eleanor and Theodora. Claire Bloom, I mean, who could play Theo as well as she did? I mean, she's wonderful. She really, I mean, I really watched her. Every time she's on screen, you just kind of can't take your eyes off of her. It's probably the smart outfit she's always wearing, and she's always got this kind of cool underlying almost contempt for what's going on, or like she's kind of amused by stuff. She's kind of just looking at this all as a lark until she doesn't. Russ Tamblyn. I love Russ Tamblyn. I kept thinking, why is Riff in Hill House? And
he's like, when you're rejected.
No, we even give him a little Russ Tamblyn moment. It's great when he's remember he says, "Oh, get some dancing girls." He's on the spiral staircase.
Yeah.
And he leaps down, very nimbly, because Russ Tamblyn is so nimble.
Yeah.
And he leaps down in that wonderful Russ Tamblyn way. And I think of Luke from the book as like he's one of those kind of sexy guys that you kind of hate yourself for being attracted to because he's such a callow kind of dork. Down. And I don't think Russ Tamblyn quite is that. I mean, it's just a different interpretation of the character. But yeah, it's a really great ghost story. It's probably the best screen ghost story, I would say.
And it's sort of timeless. Right?
It leaves out a lot of the complexities of the novel, and I feel like it goes for a more straightforward ghost story. It is Hill House happening. Hill House has chosen Eleanor, and it's victim. That's what's going to happen. Although you could make the case for other, for a more psychological interpretation as well. But I feel like the movie probably just kind of had to be more straightforward about presenting a supernatural ghost story,
Well, I found the film, the way they changed the characters' relationships. I mean, you got Eleanor all of a sudden in the film. She is attracted, she's attracted to the Professor Markham. He's changed his name from Montague to Markham in the film. And then you got, and so therefore, Luke is no longer, the maybe love interest that the book may suggest that he could be. So that changes the whole, changes everything within the film. That it's kind of a bizarre thing, which Leo uses. Getting rid of some of the minor characters when Grace shows up, the professor's wife, and then without Arthur. I think that was a big miss in the film, because I would have loved to have seen Arthur, and I would have loved to have seen Theo actually in Eleanor's clothes. I would have loved to see that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Julie Harris is quite a small actress, I think. I would say she's probably about 2. She's about 5'7", 5'8". So what is she
like She-Hulk busting out of her like tweed blouse.
And then you have, and I also sit there and say when they have to share the bed together, I mean, that works out quite a lot differently in the film as well. Because I mean, Eleanor's, she's doing everything but putting up a pillow fort, a pillow wall between them. Yeah. Like, just go to bed. Like, turn the light off, sort of thing. But it is, but the film has, it does things a bit more overtly. I mean, it does change the history of Hill House. It does give Hill House a more haunting background and than what we stated before in the book. I mean, in this one, I mean, you do have the crash on the way to the house as the house is being built. You have the second wife falling down the stairs by some.
Well, it's like it looks like she's being pushed because she's got that whole like look on her face, like what is that? And then she gets tumbles.
Yeah. And then you had, I think Crane. I don't know if he married a third time. I can't quite remember, but he's off in Europe and he dies, and he just had the one daughter, which totally changes all the relationships. With the whole, and gives Hill House a more haunting ghost story background than what you have in the book.
They make it more cinematic.
Yeah.
Obviously, they have to do.
But it does open very, very well. I mean, I have to say the opening of Hill. The Haunting really, you kind of watch it, and as soon as Richard Johnson does his narration over the top of everything, it's like you're ready to settle down into the film, and they've done a very good job of that.
Yeah,
I think a lot of what makes the film great is a casting, and I also think it has a lot to do with Robert Wise in this instance, with the way he filmed it. I think with any other kind of any kind of director, I don't think it would have the same punch that it has.
Yeah, and I think it's also like the like you were talking before earlier, the relationship between the characters, because there is sort of this underlying focus that's on Eleanor really in the film, and how she reacts to the house and how they react to her, whereas like in the book, you feel like everyone is observing the house, and then when things go too far, then it's like, oh, something's wrong with Eleanor. Yeah. I feel like from the very start, everyone is sort of careful and watchful of Eleanor, and she also reacts more externally when the focus is on her, and she doesn't like it. And it's sort of, she'll tell people how she feels, whereas I think in the book it was more internalized. Like she still does the internalization in the movie, but she definitely externalizes, like especially with Theo.
Yeah,
I am not having it, and I will not appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing in the film, the closeness between Theo and Eleanor is not really displayed in the film. Now, I don't know if I found out this later. Julie Harris is going through a nervous breakdown when she was filming The Haunting, and she and Claire Bloom did not get on because of this. And Julie Harris kept it to herself. She didn't let anyone know. Afterwards, after the film was over with, and Julie Harris got a grip on her own reality, then her and Claire Bloom ended up becoming really good friends. But during the making of it, they didn't get on because of this. So, and I have to sit there and say in the film, watching it now, it does come across that, they're not the closey good friends that they are in the book. And, and then when Theo does deliver those lines, and maybe this is, maybe they're, because of what was going on offset, maybe that's the reason why the lines become out a lot more harsher than they would normally.
I have to say it's interesting because watching the movie, it's like Theo just has like this constant resting bitch face, because like there's moments when she just like, if you look at Eleanor and there's lines between like Eleanor and Markaway, and it's meant to be very playful, you just look at Theo and Theo's just like, ugh, like, and like, oh, and there's like a line with like, oh, but what did you do with your hair? And like Nell like loses it. You told me to do this to my hair. And she just like rips her apart.
Well, the best bitch face of Theo has to basically be with, Eleanor comes bouncing down the stairs. She goes in, and there, there's the professor, and they're having breakfast, and they're having their, he's asking her questions about herself. And Theo walks in and just looks at the two of them and goes, has that look at her. Like, what are you two doing?
Or towards the end when she's like the wife shows up, who is like completely a different character than in the book. Like the wife in the book is like a paranormal expert, if not probably better than her husband, and kind of is always poking him and saying, you're not doing a good enough job, I'm going to do it for you. But like in the movie, like she comes and the wife is, well, this is just silliness, this is just silly, you're either going to come with me or I'm staying here until you go. And where should I go? What room should I be put in? And of course, like Eleanor is like, put her in the nursery, like, the worst room ever. And like Theo looks over and what is the line? She's like, I told you, or like he was married. I warned you.
Well, I think Theo is also looking at Eleanor and thinking, damn, man, you send her right to the nursery, and like
yeah,
like wow, you're a pistol. But yeah, isn't that funny that they changed Mrs. I first of all, why did they change
The
Montague to
name?
Markway? Why did they change Eleanor Vance to Eleanor Lance? I never understood that. Like, it's so pointless. But it's interesting that they changed Mrs.
I think they might have changed Markway only because it was filmed in England and because he had an English accent, maybe. I'm thinking Montague is more of a New England name.
Okay.
Even though the film's not set in England, but everyone in it except for Russ Tamblyn and Julie Harris are English. So maybe I'm kind of, I don't know if that's the case, but I'm kind of wondering did they do it that way? Maybe Markway's a lot more for
American,
mainstream America, maybe. Markway.
But why they changed Vance to Lance makes no sense. I just don't get it. Why you took the V and put an L in there? Be like, okay, why not? Whatever.
I also don't know why I hate to use it, like dummied down, but they dummied down his wife, and I thought that would have been a very interesting character to see come in and be bossy. She was bossy and pushy, and I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna do that, and like
hilarious. She's Shirley's devouring mother all over again. I mean, she's that character. You know, she's just really demanding and willful, and she's not. You know, clearly you can see who wears the pants in that marriage. As you know, she bosses him around. Her Arthur, that guy that she brings with him, is hilarious.
Which is like I feel like it's like her little like man servant. You know, it's like, okay, you go, girl. Like she's like, hey, here's my little servant boy, Arthur.
They're almost like I mean, I think she even referred to them as almost like comic relief. They're pretty funny, and maybe like for the movie they would have diluted the tension too much. And again, the movie's only it's barely 2 hours, maybe a little under 2 hours. So again, I really do look forward to this miniseries, and I'll be really curious to see what they come up with. I just hope they don't go down that terrible path that the 1999 remake of The Haunting went down.
Oh, that was like way too overly studio supernatural. Like, I mean, the fact that you put so many effects in where things are just attacking her, Eleanor. Though the casting was good. I mean, I loved what's her name that was in it. The casting was great for her, but this, it's interesting because I felt like every time I watched the movie, I kept seeing Frances Conroy as Eleanor. She her face, she looks just like looks just like her. And then I was thinking Juliette Binoche for Theodora. So I was like, if they ever redo this,
can I tell you, but I've always thought if they had remade The Haunting in like the early 70s, you know who would have been the best Eleanor? Sandy Dennis. She would have totally. She rocked the neurotic spinster, fussy. It would have been great.
Especially that character she played in Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean. Recreate that character.
You could say Julie Harris was kind of the proto Sandy Dennis, you know. Or Sandy Dennis was the sequel to Julie Harris. Can I just say, if you want to play 6 Degrees really quickly, my father went to elementary school, like he was in 2nd grade with Julie Harris in Grosse Pointe, Michigan.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's crazy.
Yes.
I mean, she pretty much had a stunning career, Julie Harris. I have to say.
Oh, yeah. Is she still alive?
No, she died a couple years ago. I mean, I think the last thing I remember is Knots Landing. That's the last thing I remember her in. But
she was in Knots Landing.
She played Val Ewing's mom.
I remember that.
She was a pistol in that as well. But but I mean, you know, if you think of her career, I mean, you know, she was I Am a Camera. You know, that's her first role, which ended up becoming the
wedding. Yeah.
And then East of Eden with James Dean.
Yeah.
So, you know, and Claire Bloom, I mean, she's still going. She still does stuff. So the
last thing I remember Claire Bloom in was Crimes and Misdemeanors, the Woody Allen movie. And that's the last thing and she was married to Roald Dahl, or was she married to Philip Roth? I think
Philip Roth was married to.
Yeah.
The one character that has to be like discussed, because I think the book she literally brings her life is Miss Dudley.
Oh yeah.
Holy Mother of God. Like that character, it was so good, and her expressions and how she just it was just so well done. And again, that actress, she didn't have that many lines, but man, she used those lines.
A tiny role, didn't she? Yeah, just that. Yeah, in the night, in the dark. She's great. Yeah, love her. I wonder what else. I should look her up on IMDb. I never really I don't know what else she ever did. But
She was mainly a stage actress, English. She did a lot of English films and English telly over here. But she didn't last very much after this film. I mean, I think she died in the 70s.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Mr. Dudley was not my. When I read the Reader's Digest condensed version of the book, those illustrations really stuck with me. And one of the illustrations was Eleanor trying to get in and Mr. Dudley, like, keeping her out of the gate. And he was drawn as this kind of portly old slob.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen these illustrations? They're really great. I mean, if you...
Oh, I used to love Reader's Digest,
If you Google Ben Stahl, The Haunting of Hill House, there's a website that prints, that puts them all on the web, and they're really beautiful illustrations. There's probably about 7 or 8 of them.
But he was a curmudgeon little old man.
Mr. Dudley looked like a basically an old mean drunk. And this guy in the movie is pretty great. He kind of calls them city people, and he's very different, very British.
And what if she's like, oh, you got scared? Seems like you're the one who's scared. You're going to regret that I let you in. Jeez.
Well, he's pretty mean, yeah. Whereas like the guy, Mr. Dudley in the book was just more like, I think he was just like trying to scare her for sport. He's just sport. What else?
The townspeople, right? The townspeople who she wasn't supposed to go see, would be the same way.
I got the sense that Mr. Dudley just was like, what a lousy job. Was he always standing at that gate?
Day in and day out, waiting for people to come,
Mowing the lawn, staying at the gate.
Those are classic Shirley Jackson characters, Mr. and Mrs. Dudley. Just these kind of small town, willful. Mrs. Dudley has a lot going on, and in the book, she's actually makes friends with Mrs. Montague later. She defends that. She says, "Oh, Theo and Eleanor they're just kids. They're just young people having fun. Come on, I'll make you some coffee." So
yeah. So, which is funny because her attitude completely changed in the book, and they became like BFFs. They're like, "Hey, you want some coffee?" And Theo and Eleanor, what the fuck? She's mean to us.
I think Mrs. Dudley was just kind of at this point. She was just kind of going to roll with it, just go with whatever, Okay.
I also think though, if she respects the house, so again, because she was an expert in paranormal activity, she's a believer. So she's like, oh, tell me what you've seen. Maybe she asked her, like, what have you seen? It's these people are all skeptics, right? So, Miss Dudley does not have time for telling people her stories that are non-believers. I set the table at 10. I get she's just like, I don't have time for you, versus someone who comes and says, oh, thank you so much for your service. What have you seen here? I'm an expert in blah, 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 and I just want to document what's going on. It's a break from her monotony, right? Of 10 o'clock, set, 1 o'clock, I do this, do it,
I would have actually, and you wonder why none of them ever ask Mrs. Dudley about herself. I suppose it's because she's so forbidding, But
no, I think it's because she's a servant, because they treat her like, just do your job, clear the table, set the,
Yeah, certainly Theo's going to have that attitude. Like, he's not going to have that.
Luke would probably have that attitude. I don't know if Eleanor would have that attitude, but then I guess Eleanor would probably just, she's not a leader, she's a follower. So I guess the other ones would have that. But I mean, as far as Grace in the book, I mean, I picture Grace when she shows up in the book, not like the film, where she'd be like kind of dressed up. When you see like these people dressed in the 50s sort of thing, but the ones who are kind of like off their rocker a little bit, like gypsy kind of looking 50s.
the big glasses and like
Lord. And the thing is, I mean, it does say that she does practice the paranormal, but I mean, everything she says about Hill House is so far off. I mean, there's a nun buried in the cellar. There's
though that little writing tool thing, it kind of gives a different exposition, and it gives clarity on like the whole Eleanor thing. Like there's things, so
mind, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, what do you guys think of the how Robert Wise presented the supernatural, the haunting aspects, the manifestations? To me, that's probably the most impressive thing about the movie. He knows when to cut the music
Yeah.
One thing so many scary movies and horror films do not know how to do is be quiet.
Yeah.
And
let the silence fill the space instead of like loud.
The scene where Eleanor is it's just the dark of night, and she's lying in bed and she's holding Theo's hand.
Oh yeah.
And she's looking at the wall, and you the wallpaper, and there's just like, you see it's like a face.
Yeah.
And Robert Wise was so smart to just, you hear the murmurings and the eerie little voices in the night. There's no music, whatever, and he zooms into it. And you remember and how the shadows from the moonlight flicker. It grows and then ebbs.
Yeah,
it's a wonderfully, really creepy scene. Really, really spooky. And I love that he knew to keep it minimal. Focus on that face,
even
quote unquote face on the wall, and the mumbling weird noises in the night, and Eleanor's growing fear.
Yeah. Even the mirrors when she's running, when Eleanor, so the first time she comes up the stairs with Miss Dudley, she slams right into that mirror, and it scared me. And I was like, well, that's kind of amazing, because I did not expect that. And then it does it again later. And I was like, okay, bravo for you for getting me twice, because it makes you jump, and those are like minimal effects that you need versus like now everything is so CGI and in your face, loud, blasting, and there's such subtlety within the angles and the movement, and when she's losing her orientation, you feel the camera shifting and moving around with her. And is it her moving or is it the house moving? Because there's that theme of you just have to watch this house because it moves every time you don't look, and that's really amazing how he was able to pull that off.
Oh, you go ahead.
I thought, as far as the wallpaper goes, I also remember where I grew up in a house that was built in the 1800s, but we had wallpaper, and during the daytime it always looks quite innocent, but at night it's like if you can't sleep and you start staring at it when you're a kid, and it's like the patterns are like normal. All of a sudden they do become faces. They do change, and I thought what you were saying with Robert Wise to cleverly use that.
Yeah,
something that looks innocent during the day all of a sudden takes on a more.
It's funny you say that, because my mom and dad had this wallpaper in the living room, and it had like leaves, like fleur-de-lis, and it always was kind of like a hodgepodge in different angles. But like at night, I used to look at that and see shapes, and I think it's your imagination, and Eleanor has an amazing imagination. She can't help but go, am I picturing this, or is this real? And then she doubts it, and then it's like there's something to where is it her manifesting, or is it just there and it's something we don't see every day?
Well, patterns do that. I mean, in my youth, my college years in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I lived in this 1920s apartment complex. They had this marble table, and me and my friends thought it would be funny to drop acid and listen to Kate Bush's Hounds of Love album instead. The marble table. We saw a whole movie in that marble table. But when you do look at patterns, they do, if you stare at a pattern long enough, they do manifest.
Shift and swirl. Yeah.
Faces, and depending on what kind of trip you're having, whether they're good pictures or bad pictures. So,
I also think it was interesting in the movie how it ends at night, and they kind of were like, oh, how do we get her out? Because, I have the key. And it's just like this weird mechanism, like, what? Wait, they're not there. The Dudleys aren't there. And they kind of go running.
I mean,
what is he doing with that key? That's an odd little...
I know, like, and the professor had it. So it was like this weird thing, like, because I was like, wait, I don't remember Luke getting in the car in the book. And then he's like, oh, wait, I'll be right back. And he gets out of the car and he runs over to he's like, oh, can I get the key to get out? And then she's like, I'm getting out of here. And it's like Thelma and Louise, and she just takes off. I'm like, and then the best part is when the wife comes running out, and it's like, I did actually laugh at that, because she was just like this woodland creature comes running out like deer in headlights.
I think that's the main difference between that's where the movie really wildly veers away from the book, is that it really makes it all, the house is really doing it is manipulating all these things. It kind of captures Mrs. Markway and kind of tosses her into this labyrinth of the house, so it can work out getting Eleanor, which is the victim it really wants. Of course, none of that is in the book at all. But again, I feel like just within the parameters of film and a popular film and all that, it makes sense. It probably made it more cinematic and easier for the audience to go with. It just made it more audience friendly, I feel.
Yeah, and I still think it's like it sticks with the whole thing of was that Eleanor? Like, again, the whole thing with them. Remember, they were running after a dog or something, and it was that Eleanor manifesting that to get them away, so that way she can get time with Theo alone. And that whole thing, was it her doing whatever she was doing to the wife, because she obviously clearly didn't like the wife. So she got her, away from them while she was able to kind of get lost in the house. So they still at least were able to stay in that same vein in that sense.
Yeah, I mean,
was it supernatural? Was it her?
But I think the movie strongly comes out in favor of it, like being the house is just this evil thing. But yeah, there's still that question of how much Eleanor is in collusion with the house. Yeah. I mean, the scene that's the biggest is when she's holding the hand, like that, the whole hand thing was very creepy. Like, she's all of a sudden not in the bed. She's clear across the room. Yeah. So you're like, oh, like, how did that happen? And she's clear across the room. And I think the movie, I think Stephen King was saying that Claire Bloom was presented as having a real lech for Eleanor, like that she, Yeah. And I think it's funny that it turns out Eleanor's sleeping in the little cot thing. Yeah, like over there, like get me away from her. And isn't that sad, because that's what she's used to, right? At her home, right? She's used to sleeping on a cot, like yeah. And even sleeping on a cot at home, and then she slept on a cot didn't she, with her mom too? Yeah. So Eleanor just cannot stay away from the cots. It's her learned behavior. Yeah.
I mean, my biggest mystery in the whole film is, how did Grace get in the trap door? I mean, how that trap door? And I laughed at that. I was like, what the hell? Like, who is this? And at first I thought, wait, is that the wife, or is that the woman who killed herself? Like, she didn't die. She didn't hang herself. She's just been up in the attic.
Yeah. And why did she open the trapdoor and then immediately close it? Imagine, just to scare Eleanor?
I thought you heard me. I'm like, how would we hear you close the damn trapdoor so quickly?
Well, I also thought it was quite funny. They're sending Eleanor away, And then, Grace shows up. She goes, didn't you see me? It's like, oh, so we didn't need to send Eleanor away. It wasn't in her head. It was actually... Yeah. She died for nothing.
Yeah. She's like, thanks for killing her.
Yeah, really. She has to really kind of... Mrs. Markman really has to kind of explain herself. Like, no, I really wasn't... Seriously, this was done to me. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. It's
yeah.
Kind of funny. She just sounds almost a little guilty there.
Yeah.
And because Theo's kind of looking at her like, you killed Eleanor.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what's interesting about the book, is because the way it ends so shockingly, and then it goes back to that narration of the 90. Well, in the book it's 80 years, but you're left with a lot of unanswered questions still. Where in the movie, she dies, and there are. Oh, maybe this is where she belongs. And they answer some of that, but it's kind of like, I personally love the book ending versus the movie ending, because it left you just uneasy. Like, oh my God, she just killed herself. It's like, oh, and it was intentional. Like, she killed herself, versus in the movie, it's like, is this something was grabbing her wheel, and she's, oh my God, what's going on? And then she's like, wait, maybe I should maybe it wants me here. And then she lets go, and she
sees Grace to that away, doesn't she? So
yeah.
I mean, the thing is, another thing with Eleanor's story, I mean, in the book and in the film sort of thing, I mean, with Eleanor, I mean, maybe death was better than going back to the life that she left behind.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
And so you do have that whole aspect playing in it. I mean,
well, she hates her niece, and she hates her sister. So,
and can you imagine the hell that she's going to get when she brings that car back?
What did you do to my car?
Yeah, she's the worst. Yeah, I think any ghost story. The reason, of course, I will always look more is, and again, because Shirley Jackson's wonderful writing, her prose is so lyrical, and but I just think any ghost story, most horror films and stuff, if you have some unanswered questions, don't wrap everything up. Have some ambiguity. It always helps me to go back to. It's fun to contemplate. I don't want everything answered, because then where's the fun in that? Involve me, let me interpret or question or wonder about things. I just think it always makes for a stronger piece.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, the book and the film are a circular film. I mean, they begin and they end it the same way.
Yeah.
What I did like about the book was, after Eleanor's death, before it goes, it just starts off with the sentences that began the book. You have what the characters are now, and it's almost like they just went back to their lives. Eleanor's dead. It's not, and they just continued on.
Yeah.
The only person that had any problems would be Montague, because obviously, because of the death of Eleanor, obviously it's affected his paper to a certain extent, because it took away some of his legality within his profession, or what he used to do.
And they basically, she mentions too that it was basically his paper was laughed at. They just it was a big failure for him.
And Luke went back to doing what Luke does, and Theo went back to her girlfriend / flatmate or whatever, and
her field ways.
She went back to her whomever.
Which is quite brilliant, because after the death of anything, like, life continues on, and I thought that was quite a nice little way. And then of course, then you get that that hook at the end about Hill House and standing 80 years, and
I have walked alone. It's very. I've read. Like I'm a member on Goodreads. I do reviews and stuff there, and one person, more than one reviewer, amateur reviewer, which is what we all are in Goodreads, has talked about how heartbreaking the end of the book is. It's so tragic, because you guys talked about, one of you guys brought up Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, and I think there's a real correlation between the two of them, that they're both about these troubled female characters that really tried to change their fortunes. And they had so many strikes against them, and they failed. Neither one of them, they both ended up dead, and they're both really tragic stories. It's kind of weird, because with Eleanor's death, I think if there is an afterlife, I think that she kind of won to a certain extent. I'm saying that she is not, like, if she's going to end up haunting Hill House, it has to be better than what she would have gone back to.
Yeah.
So I always look at it that way for some reason. I don't, maybe that's me looking the Pollyanna outside. Yay, everything's good. But I don't. But when I saw Eleanor, and the first time I read it, I thought, oh God, this is really sad. And then, like, the older I get, and I said, I interviewed Laurence Hyman. I said, when I read his mom's work, it's funny, but as I read it every 6 years, of course I age, and I look at every single thing differently. Every time I read it, I see it differently, and I my way of thinking. And now, when I was seeing it and reading about Eleanor's death, I thought, oh, she's finally going to be happy now.
Yeah,
like the end of, not the movie Carrie, but the end of the book Carrie. When I read that, I was, the first time I read it, I was so depressed, because Carrie's a victim all the way through it, and I was really upset with Carrie. But you do have an epilogue where this girl gets born into this family, and she's able to move things, and the family's accepting of her. And then when I reread Carrie about a couple of years ago, when I got to the epilogue, and I was kind of, oh, Carrie, dying, it's so promising. Please don't go up to that stage. And I'm always thinking this when I'm reading it. And then with the epilogue, I thought, oh, she died and she was reincarnated into a family that's going to accept her. And that's how I kind of looked at it now. So, but I think the ambiguous ending, I mean, maybe she's.
There's also something about age and aging. And, I unfortunately, my mother's in a hospital now. And when you think about aging and aging gracefully, right, and passing away and having no ailments, both of these women, who one dying, her mother, and then the other one, the sister, dying, there's a part of her that has to sort of find peace in dying young as Eleanor, because I think one of her probably biggest fears is, like, dying the same way and having someone take care of her like she had to take care of her mother. Though she treated it like a gift in some ways, there was also that she was haunted by the fact that her mother died and she wasn't there for her. So there's something about being able to die in your own, I guess, youth that maintains that sort of like ability to like die on your own way in some ways, I guess, versus like going to a point of old age where you have to trust that a caregiver is going to take care of you. And I don't want to be a burden, I don't want to feel like I'm a burden to someone. Like I know personally, going through my own personal experience with my mother, I wouldn't want to be that old in the sense of like having someone take care of me. Like I would rather be younger-ish or die in a way that's very peaceful and calm.
Yeah. Well, I'm remembering at the end of the book, I'm actually looking at the last page of the story right now. And she says, I am really doing it, she thought, turning the wheel to send the car directly up the great tree at the curve of the driveway. I am really doing it. I am doing this all by myself now. At last, this is me. I'm really, really doing it by myself. But then at the end, right before it crashes, she thinks clearly, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why don't they stop me? So there's that terrible tension. Like, I can't help myself. I don't want to do this. I do, it's, and it's that great unresolved quality of the book that I think that keeps this, that's one of the things that keeps this book alive, this story alive. And it's kind of become like the lottery. It's immortal. You keep, I love what you were just talking about with aging and all that. I mean, you just bring your own stuff into it, and the book invites that.
Yeah.
And that's why Shirley Jackson was a great writer, and why her books endure. So,
Keith, actually, why don't we go and open the doors and windows and air out our final thoughts?
The Haunting of Hill House for me, is timeless. It'll never age. We were talking about a book that was written in, was it the 40s or the 50s?
1959.
59, yeah.
And to be honest, I'm so happy. I mean, Shirley Jackson's getting a resurgence now. I mean, we got The Haunting of Hill House opening in the West End as a play. That's coming to London, which will go to New York in another year's time.
Yay.
We Always Live in the Castle has just been completed, and according to Shirley Jackson's son, he helped executive produce it, and he's seen the film 4 times, and he loves it. He says it's fantastic.
Yay.
There's other productions of her stuff going in, and I mean, all her stuff is timeless. And it's good that she was respected in her time, but she's more respected now, and there's a whole new audience for her. And I sit there, if you're going to start reading Shirley Jackson, I would suggest starting with The Haunting first, and then you can read any of her stuff, her short stories. She was way ahead of her time. I mean, another thing that I could say about Shirley Jackson, she can attack social issues like no one can believe. She has a book called After You, My Dear Fons, that deals with racism. And if you ever want to read anything that really tackles an issue like that without slamming an agenda into your face, that's where to go to. But yeah, The Haunting of Hill House book and film are fantastic, and it's one that everyone should at least read if you have an interest in horror or psychological films, or books that are psychological or horror, or even regular fiction. Shirley Jackson is not a horror writer. She is a fiction writer that deals with truths, and she's one of the ones to go to. Highly suggested.
Rob?
It's funny. And when you were talking about all those movies and stuff that are coming out, the back of the Shirley Jackson Project, I put a bibliography, and I put some selected film adaptations, and I'm just so happy at how incomplete it is already. I mean, I didn't know about any of these things. I think we went to press right before I'd heard about We Have Always Lived in the Castle. So it ends, unfortunately, my bibliography, the film adaptations, ends with The Haunting from 1999, which is not the best place to end, but I'm very happy that her work is being read and reread and now adapted to more film for the new generation. And basically what I was saying right before then, her work is timeless and it's endlessly interpretable. And I was very happy to talk with you about this book and this film with you guys today.
Nice. Yeah. And for me, Shirley Jackson is just amazing at, like he said, being able to bring up really timeless issues that we face in our society. And she uses an object, in the Haunting of Hill House as a sort of metaphor for each of us, because we all in some ways are haunted with things in our lives, and it's how we deal with them and how we interact with others, and sort of embrace those sort of issues in our lives. And that really relates to how we develop as human beings, as artists. And she definitely, to me, inspires me as a writer, and has inspired one of my favorite authors, Stephen King, and many, many other writers. And I see why. And love The Lottery. I'm now happy to say that I've read The Haunting of Hill House, and I'm going to read many, many more of her pieces. But yeah, it's timeless. It's amazing. And I hope that each of our listeners are inspired to actually go and read her work, because again, I think she's just a brilliant author. So.
One other thing, if you like audiobooks, I highly suggest Bernadette Dunn's interpretation of The Haunting of Hill House, available on audio. Fantastic. Great audio. She really captures the essence of Hill House, if you're into audiobooks.
Nice. So as we begin to depart the haunted halls of Hill House, on behalf of myself and Keith, we thank you for joining us, and a special thank you to our guest, Rob Kirby, for venturing the paranormal with us. Make sure to check out the Shirley Jackson Project, comics inspired by her life and work, which is, again, available now at ninthartpress.com. If you would like to leave us a review or comment, you can go to our website at www.mbliterary.com and click on the Literary Podcast tab. We are also on Facebook at Literary Podcasts, as well as Twitter at LITLICPOD.
LitLockPod.
Huh? What'd you say?
LitLockPod.
LitPod. We welcome any and all reviews, so make sure to like, comment, share, and repeat. Tune in next month for our podcast, which will be On the Road by Cormac McCarthy. Until then, journeys end in lovers of podcast meeting. Thank you for joining us. Thank guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
She walks these hills all dressed in white. The witchy woman of the night comes in with crossing bones and voodoo dolls into this haunted house. She's casting spells on me. I'm still waiting for this light to tell me I can find my way around this old house is haunted, keeping me locked up in my room. She calls upon the sun and stars. She mixes blood and spit and wine and jars with Ouija boards till ghosts surround us in this haunted house. I get so lost in this undo, waiting for this light to tell me I can find my way around this old house is haunted, falling closer to the moon. She swears she never means me any harm. Waits till I get home.
Knows my name. This time it knows my name.
Is it over, Theo? Is it? No. I'm so cold. It's going to start everything all over again. God, it knows I'm here.
Have you ever seen a dream? Have you ever seen
House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within its walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and the doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House. And whatever walked there, walked alone.